All right. So, like I said, this is going to be a somewhat smaller group today, which is great because I look at your faces, and even if no one else joins us, I know how much I love talking to both of you. So, I think this is going to be a fun time together. So, if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to open us up in a word of prayer. Dearest Lord, we thank you for this opportunity to come together both here in this time and in whatever other time that people will be joining us. We thank you for this opportunity to be here on this earth, to be trying to unravel your mysteries and go probe deeper into our history and into our present, and in so doing, carving a future. We pray that you would open our hearts and minds to know you, to know each other, to love you better. We love you, Lord. Amen. So it probably would have been a good thing for me to have pulled this video up before I started, but here we go. So here's something I realized after last week is that when I'm recording, it will record the person who is currently talking in a full screen view. When I share my screen, it will share it and then also record the last person who talked. So for the sake of not having you be recorded while you're watching a video, if you both want to mute yourselves real quick.
Where do I do it?
Move your mouse over the screen and it should be the middle button that pops up.
The screen. The whole screen? Or the little screen up in the corner?
I think you'll see a pop-up at the bottom of your screen, maybe, and there's some little icons. One's a phone and one looks like a microphone.
Microphone, got it.
Yay! You both got it. Fabulous. Well done. Okay, so now we are experimenting, figuring it out as we go, which is how we've been doing every single thing for the past 6 months or so. So you all are doing great. So let's go into one of my favorite and most exciting topics. Hey friends, welcome back. This is part 3 of the Space Between YouTube series, where we're exploring the space between the Hebrew and the Christian scriptures in order to get a better understanding of the world that Jesus inhabited. Now, one of the things we often do when we're thinking about history and talking about history is we talk about it as if it were just a series of wars and kings and queens and wars. We're all guilty of this. It's super easy to do because you have names and you have dates and you have places and everything is really clear and easy to talk about, but it's so overly simplistic. And it doesn't actually describe what is happening and what are the true forces of history. So, that being said, while Alexander the Great and his, whole conquering of Greece and everywhere up to India is kind of a big deal, historically speaking, it's not really what changed the world. What changed the world in that time period was Hellenism. Now, Hellenism is the period of Greek culture that didn't actually include any Greeks, which is wonderful. Alexander himself was a Macedonian, and he sprinkled Greek culture with him wherever he went, which resulted in all of these cultural mashups in all the places where he had conquered. Imagine, if you will, like 12 glasses of colored liquid. And now, if you were to add yellow dye into each and every one of them, none of the glasses would be yellow, but they would all be different colors. And all of those colors would contain yellow pigment. It's kind of what's happening during this time period. And we'll get into what that mixture looked like specifically in Judah over the next 3 or 4 weeks. But today, in order to understand what was happening, we have to talk about Greek culture, right? And so we get to go to my favorite period of history, and that being classical Greece. And we get to talk about my favorite thing, which is the birth of science. I know, right? So, because this time period has a lot of long Greeky names that are hard to remember and keep straight, and a lot of really complicated thought that literally can take up entire PhD programs to really understand, we're going to focus instead on the move from mythos to logos. These are Greek words. Mythos, you can think of as the stories that explain why things happen and what their meaning is. So, how we live and who we are. These are usually stories that are supernatural in origin. The gods are doing things. There's big spectacle, and they explain things like why we have seasons, or why there is rain, and why there's a forest fire, and all of that individual experiences. Logos means a rational discourse about the nature of the world. So biology is bio, life, and logos, a reasoned discourse about the thing. So the movement from mythos to logos, the movement from stories of meaning of why things happen to a discourse about how things happen. There's this movement that happens during this time period. And now, so first of all, we have to talk about Thales of Miletus, not least of which because of his amazing beard. Isn't it beautiful? That's a face you carve out of marble. Also, I apologize because he comes before the beginning of our timeline, so he doesn't really fit there. I'll have to put an arrow pointing to how far back he goes. So Thales was the first person to challenge the prevailing mythos of the time. The mythos of the time was found mostly in the writings of Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey, as well as Hesiod. This is where we get all the stories of the 12 major Greek gods and the creation of the world and the way that they fought with each other and the creation of lesser gods and heroes and all of these great stories that make wonderful movies and scary bedtime stories. So he's the first one to really challenge that. He was somebody who was lucky enough to be able to travel. So he traveled down to Egypt, where he learned about geometry, which, if you've seen a pyramid, you know the Egyptians know a thing or two about. He went up to Babylon, where he learned all about their star charts and their early astronomy and astrology, the likes of which, maybe would have been the predecessors to the Magi who saw the star in the heavens and came to visit the baby Jesus. And when he got home, he tested all of these various theories that he had about the way things worked, and he found that he could predict the future, not using tea leaves or reading the entrails of a goat or something like that, but by theory, by hypothesis, by testing something over and over and over again until he figured it out what was behind the universal truth of the thing. There's one wonderful story that's told by Socrates about how his neighbors used to make fun of him because he was poor and he lived this simple ascetic lifestyle because he spent all of his days in books and doing science experiments, and they didn't even know what that meant. And so in order to get back at him, he spent some time studying the weather patterns and found that, according to his theory, his hypothesis was that the next season should be a very rainy season. Now, generally to that point, people would have just prayed for a rainy season and made the right sacrifices and prayed that whichever god or goddess it was that was their local deity would help them with rain and with a great harvest of olives. But he used deductive reasoning to say, you know what? We're going to get one. And so in the off season, he went and he rented every single olive press in the town, And so when there was this bumper crop of olives and all the farmers realized they had to go rent more olive presses, he had a monopoly. He had all of them. And so he lent them back to them at exorbitant prices and made an absolute killing, and then went back to just living simply. Because the whole thing was just to show them that philosophical thinking and scientific thinking and just reasoning and thinking about thinking had practical uses, but you didn't need to use them. You could just love learning and reason for the sake of itself. There's another story where he predicted a solar eclipse using some of the knowledge he had gained in Babylon, and two armies were fighting, and the sun disappeared and went into darkness, and they were so terrified, and he had predicted it, and so he was seen as this like wizard of sorts. So as he and his students began to explain more of the natural world through natural means, the gods got smaller and smaller and smaller. They weren't needed anymore to explain the natural forces of the world, the movement of the sun, of the stars, and all of that. And so he began to talk about divinity being in everything. He thought even magnets had a bit of the divine in them because they moved. So the old way of thinking about things was that gods of various types controlled all the forces of life. You know, Apollo made the sun go across the sky and all of those very specific elements of life. But the new way of thinking that was emerging with Thales and his students was that natural forces controlled all of life, and divinity became a more abstract concept, something more other and out there, but yet within each and every one of us. For example, Xenophanes, which is one of those wonderful Greek names, isn't it? Xenophanes. It starts with an X. It's super cool. Anyway, he hypothesized that clouds were just evaporated water that would fall back to Earth and then flow into the ocean, and then the sun would heat it up and it would evaporate and make clouds, which would rain down. It's the water cycle. It's the thing you learned in 5th grade. He came up with this all the way back then. And he was also a bit antagonistic about the people who still believed in the gods. And so he wrote in one of his poems about how some people believe that rainbows are made by the goddess Iris. And he wrote, quote, "And she whom they call Iris, this too is by nature a cloud, purple, red, and greenish yellow to behold." He's so cheeky. He's like, oh yeah, and that god you worship, Iris, she's actually just a cloud. It's probably no wonder that a lot of these early philosophers got arrested and some of them executed or kicked out. Later, Xenophanes said of the Greek gods, he said, quote, "But if cattle and horses and lions had hands, or could paint with their hands and create works such as men do, horses like horses and cattle like cattle also would depict the gods' shapes and make their bodies of such sort as the form they themselves have. Ethiopians say that their gods are snub-nosed and black. Thracians say that theirs are pale and red-headed." So just like, hey, you all are making gods in your own image because that's how you imagine them. There's no reason behind why you would imagine a god that way. They're probably not like that at all. Actually, later, one of the early church fathers, Clement of Alexandria, quoted Xenophanes and wrote that there is one God, greatest among gods and humans, like mortals neither in form nor in thought. I mean, that could just come from the Bible, couldn't it? So there's a movement that starts here with Thales and his students and their students and their students for the next couple hundred years. And that if the works of the gods can be explained naturally, what remains of the spiritual world? Will it all just be explained away and just be all natural? Is there no room for gods? Are we all headed towards atheism? Well, friends, enter Pythagoras. You remember him, right? He's the hypotenuse guy from 9th grade geometry. He was a lot more than that, too. Pythagoras was a larger-than-life personality, miracle worker, head of a new religious order, most of his discoveries and his personality are shrouded in legend and myth, and probably were things come up with by his followers and not necessarily him, but we don't have time to get into that. At the heart of everything for Pythagoras were numbers, equations. Everything can be explained by a number. Math could explain everything. Math could even explain the divine, or at least maybe math was the divine, because math could explain music. He's the one that discovered that different sized things resonate at different frequencies and that you can mathematically predict how to tune an instrument. Math could explain structures like pyramids. Math could explain matter, and math could explain movement and interaction and collision. He said that the planets move around in predictable mathematical paths, and that those paths align with musical notes. And so if you could listen closely enough, you would hear the music of the spheres. This is my Father's world, our hymn. That phrase comes from Pythagoras, and this idea that behind everything is this divine numerology, this mathematics that undergirds everything. I mean, what he's describing is modern physics without calling it as such, still wrapped up in this divine mysticism. He also taught that the human soul was eternal, uncreated from the dawn of time. The generally acceptable thought about the soul in those days and the fate of humans when they died is that their soul left their body and it went into the underworld, and over time it was forgotten and it just ended up in a swirling mass of former life that is neither conscious nor aware of anything that's going on, and occasionally can be brought up by Hades to answer a question or two, but there's really no life after death, as it were. But Pythagoras says that our souls are eternal. They're a part of that divine cosmic energy that was neither created nor is destroyed, but when a person dies, their soul is transmuted into another soul. That soul, that body that it becomes next is decided by how they lived in this life. That it's possible to escape the cycles of death and rebirth through living a good life and understanding all of the truths and the mysteries of the world and of the soul. He was claimed to be able to remember at least 4 previous lives before this. That was a gift that Hermes had given to him. And so, to sum up where we've been so far, this development of Greco philosophical scientific thought, this initial questioning of the mythological ways that we've thought about the universe, is that the universe can be defined. It can be understood, not by proper sacrifice or understanding these other gods, but by absolute laws that are repeatable and understandable. That the gods who deal in individual situations are just not needed anymore. You can explain them away. That the senses might be unreliable. You might not know if that coiled up rope is a snake or a rope. You might be tricked by your smell or your hearing, but reason and mathematics can unlock the inner workings of the universe and understanding of the self. The human soul, probably eternal, and its potential can be unlocked through reason and through ethics. And then this all culminates in leading us to, by far, the most influential man in all of Western history, Plato. Which, by the way, might possibly not be his real name, but might be his wrestling name that his wrestling coach gave him, because he was a professional wrestler as well, and it means broad-chested. So you imagine, basically, when you're thinking about Plato, think about him as The Rock or Arnold Schwarzenegger. That's who is saying these things. So Plato expands and corrects earlier philosophies and proposed that the only way to understand truth was to cut through the natural world and to understand instead the true logic behind it. He famously said that this whole life is nothing but a shadow of truth that our souls yearn to return to. Our souls instinctively know the truth, but our senses are blocked by it. This earthly body, this fleshly prison is holding the soul back. That everything from human beings to kitchen tables have their perfect form represented in another reality of pure reason, where the form of tableness exists and the form of humanness exists. You know, John plays with this idea in John 1 when he says that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He's saying that the underlying logic, because the word here for word is logos, the underlying logos, the logic, the truth, the framework that undergirds all of reality was made flesh in Jesus, and that therefore Jesus is the link to knowing God, to understanding God, to your soul being connected to God. And Christian theologians would later equate Plato's world of the forms to heaven. And some early church fathers considered Plato divinely inspired because of how his philosophy helped to explain Christianity. Or you can, like many modern scholars, say it the other way. That it's not that Plato helps to understand Christianity, not that Plato undergirds Christianity through divine revelation, but that Plato makes his way into Jewish thought, and Christianity springs from Jewish thought. And so, of course, when you read Plato, you'd see something familiar because it had already made its way into Jewish thought. See, Plato and his famous student Aristotle, you may have heard of him too, they provided the philosophical framework for much of what medieval Christianity and Jewish thought would develop over the next couple of millennia. So much so that both of them are venerated in modern Catholicism and Rabbinic Judaism. And so why, you may be asking, did the works of Plato and Aristotle spread so widely? Well, part of that probably has to do with Aristotle's most famous student, Alexander the Great. Remember him from the beginning of this video? The guy represented by the Greek pottery in the timeline right about here? Yeah. Yeah, so like a bee carrying pollen, Alexander goes all over the ancient world spreading these ideas of Plato and Aristotle and the rest of Greek philosophy behind him. So to wrap this all up, have you ever noticed how some early parts of the Bible make God out to seem almost like a human? Where God says things like, "Ugh, I regret making humanity. I just want to kill them all and start over again." And God says that to Moses and to Noah. Or when God changes his mind about something. Or when God seems capricious and scary, or when God controls the weather, God stops the sun for Joshua. There's all of these times where God is a personal, close force, almost anthropomorphic. And then by later Hebrew Bible and into the early Christian scriptures, God is more of a benevolent spiritual force that works through humans instead of through direct action. And this shift in how we think about the divine probably starts with Thales. And then it found its full expression in the writings of Plato and Aristotle, and then mixed in with all the various worldviews of the people that Alexander conquered. And this time period is when the Jewish thinkers start to really, truly consider the immortality of the human soul, or the post-death destination of humans, or the implications of one single divine reality outside of the cosmos. And it becomes so intertwined with Jewish writers that later Jewish authors will invent stories of Aristotle converting to Judaism after being sent a copy of the Torah, or of Plato getting all of his ideas from Moses. Because the similarities between the Jewish thought in the first century and the Platonic thought are so similar. There's so many of them. But it's also important to note here that the Jews did not just accept Greek thought hook, line, and sinker. That this is a gradual process that begins during this time, but keeps going. It's this process of spiritual discernment, of adaptation, and divine revelation mixed throughout. And personally, I believe that the Spirit of God was at work in that process, guiding and shepherding truth, so that we might know God better and know truth and be able to communicate that truth in our own cultural mindsets. And whether or not you want to believe that or want to believe that the whole thing is a human construct, that's up to you. As we work our way through this time, you can make that discernment on your own. But next week, oh boy, next week, Alexander is dead. It happened pretty quickly. He was only 33. And all of his generals slice up the empire, and Judah is in the hand of the Ptolemies of Egypt. The Bible gets translated into Greek, and unicorns pop up in it. That's a fun story. The Alexandria becomes almost like a second Jerusalem, and all that, and the introduction of tax collectors. Next week, friends. I'll see you then.
All right. So a lot of names, a lot of ideas really quickly. So what are your initial clarifying questions about what you heard?
Okay, if I get this right, the Old Testament was mostly handed down to the priest, and they had scrolls that they kind of kept some of this together,
Mm-hmm.
and then it keeps progressing. And you said like when Babylon took and split up the Jewish, or took them away and stuff like that, those scrolls went with the captives, right?
We're not
Yes.
sure.
But
We're not sure if they
okay,
went
it
or
was
if they.
never. Okay, so you don't really know for sure where those scrolls were to begin with, whether they stayed back or if they were taken forward into
Mhm.
other countries. So now the people that weren't captured, they kind of just, I guess, when they did worship, that was mostly word of mouth then? Would that be how they would have worshiped God back there?
Sure. I think they probably was just sacrificially based. You do the best with what you can.
Okay,
Similarly to like the way that you might think of like the American pioneers out on the West. How do they do church? On the Oregon
okay,
Trail.
okay.
So worship at that time, maybe before they were taken away to Babylon, would have really consisted of like killing a goat in the temple and maybe saying a prayer.
Yes.
Like there wouldn't have been like a reading scripture and a sermon the way we do worship now.
Yeah, prior to Babylon, yeah. And it's also worth noting that, we read through all of the laws in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and we think that that applies to everyone, but those are purity laws that mostly have to do with the priests, the Levites. A lot of what we have passed down now as moralistic teaching originally was a way to keep the priests pure so that they could make the sacrifices for the people.
Okay.
What we have now as a personal religion is they didn't quite have yet. That develops during this time period that we're talking about now.
So now is when they start maybe writing things down or changing some of the things that they had in their scrolls or something, or studying them more in depth.
Yeah. Well, we talked last week about how Ezra and his crew would have gathered up all the scrolls from Jerusalem and abroad and edited them together and discerned which were reliable and which traditions to keep and which to kind of do away with and what to build up. And while they're going through this whole process of discerning who they are, meanwhile, at the same time, but not quite connected to, was this big revolution in philosophy and science in Greece. So these two worlds of the early teachers of Judah formulating the Hebrew scriptures, and the Greeks over there in the Greek mainland and in the colonies beginning to do this rational, reasonable thought. They're both fomenting together, and then once Alexander comes through, then they get all mixed up. Do you want me to bring the timeline back up? I don't know if I have it.
We're not clear on when the Hebrew Bible was first put into writing, correct?
Not really. We know that under King Josiah, so this is well before the exile, he discovered the book of the law in the temple, which is presumably parts of Deuteronomy. So we know that there were things written. When Ezra is writing the books of Chronicles, he's mentioning that he's using source material from a more complete version of the histories of the kings. And if you want more detail, go read those things. That's what he says at the end of all the chapters. And we can't read them anymore, so thanks for that. He was giving us a Reader's Digest version with these books, so we know that at his point there were things written. We don't know how much.
Do we know fairly reliably that Ezra was the guy who wrote a lot of like Chronicles and some of what we have now in the canon?
As reliably as we know anything else. I mean, it's probably him and his people, right? That then will get the credit for it. You know the way that we do things, where we'll say like, oh yeah, Trump fixed the stock market, but he didn't do anything to the stock market. His administration did, but then he gets the credit for it. Or where people are like, thanks Obama, like he didn't do anything. His people did, but he gets the credit. So Ezra probably did some of it, and then Ezra's people did some of it.
Sure.
Just like with Pythagoras, like I was saying, that he either was the most prolific inventor and brilliant mathematician in the entire universe, or we're attributing all of his student stuff to him as well. Or like Edison. Edison had a whole factory full of people doing his work for him, and he gets the credit for the light bulb. So any clarifying questions about the beginnings of Greek thought that I ran through fairly quickly?
I don't remember much of my history from way back when. So,
well, and worth noting too, I said it at the end, and I'll say it again, that this is not something that just happened. Even though someone like Xenophanes might stand up and say, your gods are jokes. If horses could talk, they'd make horse gods. You're just making gods that look like you, and that's not actually true. There's one ultimate reality. There's one ultimate God. Xenophanes can say that, but that doesn't mean that everyone in Greece believes it, or that,
and there was probably other people too that might have thought that but didn't say it. Or
right. So there's probably a lot of people that believe it, a lot of people that don't, plenty of people who have never heard the name before. We have like 1% of all documents that are ever written that have survived for all this time. So uh, certainly there's still a lot of worship of individual deities. There's still a lot of the mythos way of thinking. We read in the New Testament about Paul and Barnabas going into, oh, where did they go? Were they in Ephesus where they were like, "Oh, you two must be Zeus and Hermes,"
Hmm.
and they tried to treat them like gods, and they said, "No, no, no," and then a whole kerfuffle happened because they still believed very firmly in this way of seeing the world. So this is just the beginning of the change of the way that the people would think, and we're kind of at the beginning of it.
More like they were thinking or questioning more so now than before.
Yeah, I find it really comforting, by the way, that this is 2,400 years ago, and they're asking the same kinds of questions that we are today. That, like, okay, so if Apollo used to cause uh, eclipses as a sign and as a warning, but now we see that you can predict them using science, is Apollo real? And do we need a personal God anymore? And will we eventually explain God away entirely?
I don't think we're that smart.
But we're having that conversation now, right? Like, I don't know how many people I've met who are like, I don't believe in God, I believe in science.
But who made the science?
Yeah, I mean, why not both?
Well, I mean, you know who you're talking to, so I
Yeah. I guess I'm preaching to the choir.
my father-in-law swears that the phrase is actually singing to the choir and not preaching to the choir, because he's like, of course you'd preach to the choir, they need to hear the sermon, but you'd never sing to a choir because they're better than you. So I like to think of, I'm just singing to the choir. That's
There's a certain logic in that.
yeah. So I find that this criticism that starts to come up during this time period, that people have been imagining gods to be responsible for every little part of their life, that you stub your toe and it's some god getting back at you, to the sun is rising, it must be a god in their chariot, to we see pictures in the stars, they must be heroes that are trapped up there, like that there's some larger than life explanation for everything. um how much of that is us projecting ourselves onto God and onto the universe, that everything has to revolve around us? So, like, Xenophanes saying that if horses could talk, their gods would have horse heads. Uh, and I think of like, what are the ways that you have imagined God? Like, what is God to you in your mind?
Well, it's changed over the years, that's for sure. Because when I was younger, I probably thought of him more in a human form,
Mm,
um, more like a fatherly type person.
mm,
Um, Now, older, yeah, and I always figured God was out there somewhere.
mm,
But now I kind of feel it's more power, energy, um, and he's not out there. He's in me and in everything that he's created. At least that's the way I kind of feel.
mm.
Um,
That's a beautiful way to think about it. It sounds like you've done that transition already from thinking about God as just a bigger person, like all that is person but bigger, into something that is even bigger than your idea of personhood.
in other
Something,
words, you really can't define him.
yeah.
You can imagine things. And well, I guess maybe when I was younger, we read that we were created in his image. So maybe that's why I projected the human form on him then. And now, because he's God, he's bigger than anything. And you can't contain him. My mind's not.
No, you're there. That we hear image and we think of a picture. Like created in God's image means God has brown hair.
Okay.
When I'm not sure that that's what they were imagining when they said the image of God in Scripture.
Okay.
I often would catch myself thinking of God as sort of my good luck charm. If I wanted something to happen, I would pray for God to make it happen, whether it really was important or not. And yeah, you know, and at times I think we also think of him as like sort of fire insurance for the afterlife. But I think what I'm kind of hearing Karen say sort of is we think of him as this sort of inscrutable other entity, and we've kind of gotten to a point where we recognize some spark of his presence in ourselves.
Mm.
Wow.
Well, that kind of goes. Is it Plato? You said that. Now that just went through my brain real quick and then left. It'll come back around maybe.
Well, I actually wanted to bring him up, so thank you for that. That when we think about God, we often talk about God as being perfect, and that idea of perfection comes from Plato. Like if you think like what is perfect, you might imagine something that is so good it can't be added to. Because if you could add to it, it's not perfect.
Okay.
Right? Then it's 99% instead of 100%. So then God must be unchanging, and full and complete. And so there's no room for the God of the Old Testament who changes his mind, or is on his way to kill Moses, or regrets decisions, or has anger, or love, or emotions, or feelings, because they all imply change, and you can't have change and be perfect. And so we start to get a very sterile God during this time period with Plato, a God who can't really interact with people other than in a show. Like they would explain away God being angry by God pretending to be angry to show humans. Or God didn't regret creating humans in Genesis. God pretended to regret so that you could relate, but God knew what God was doing the whole time. So God has to change. And our idea of heaven, or as paradise, as this garden of all good things, becomes a sort of static, unchanging place in the clouds where everything is perfect and nothing changes. And that is Plato's world of the forms. That's not the Jewish heaven. But we start to confuse the two because we buy into his idea of what perfection means. Right? So when the Bible says, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect, it doesn't want you to be spotless or like done with improvement because you're so good. But it's this idea of perfection as being what you were designed to do. Like this pen here is perfect in that it writes. It was designed to write and it writes. So it's perfect in the Hebrew sense. It's imperfect in the Greek sense because the front of it comes off if you touch it too much. And it could be improved upon because it could be a click pen.
I do love clicky pens.
It's also a Fisher Space pen, so they're the best pens in the world. They've been to the moon. Not this one. This one came from Staples.
So perfection. I don't know. I've always just had this sort of different take on some of the Old Testament stuff because as humans writing this, how do we know God's mind exactly? And some of that kind of stuff. But there was some meme on the internet not long ago, and that kind of stuck out to me. It said, "Our problem following Jesus is that we're trying to be better reflection or better versions of ourselves rather than a more accurate reflection of Him." And it kind of seems like that sort of speaks to that difference between those two ideas about perfection. The one is sort of being spotless, perfectly spotless all the time, and the other has this idea of kind of perfectly imperfect, like your space pen.
Yeah, like what were you created to be? What is
What if-
your purpose as a human? Yeah, Karen.
What if it meant perfect means to love? Because God wants a relationship with the creations, or with what He created.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that I don't know if
No, you're there. You're there. I think that's what humans are for. Humans are this wonderful expression of the ability to love.
because God made us that way, but He also gave us the free will to choose.
Mm-hmm.
God's perfect in the fact that He loves all that He created, not just one thing. He loves all things. So maybe that's our mission in life is to love and to try and get along with her. I don't know.
I read from Julian of Norwich today, who's my favorite saint. I read at Mary Blissett's funeral a passage from her, and she has this wonderful insight that we as humans, what she would call our soul, is the spirit of God in us. That God basically creates the soul as a home where the divine can dwell. And the divine is what the divine is. And we have been given a will that fights against that and sometimes is in a line with it. But that part of you that is the dwelling place of God's spirit is never diminished. It's like this, it's almost like your spirit's black box, like airplanes have, that survives plane crashes, and like that, you're not able to taint your soul. You can let what she would call your sinful nature take over and be louder, but that spark of the divine is never extinguished from within you. So there is always a part of you that is.
I'll go along with that. I can agree with that. I think each person has part of God in them. I don't know how to explain it. That was a good way to explain it. And even people that aren't Christian or that don't proclaim it, they still have that in them. And I think God just waits for them to realize it.
Hmm.
Um,
It's interesting. If you look at like Pythagoras and you look at Buddha
uh-huh,
and
that's a Hindu.
Hinduism
Yeah.
and parts of Christianity and Zoroastrianism and all of these religions, once they start to acknowledge the presence of a soul within a person, they have to then answer what happens after they die.
Okay.
Because older Judaism doesn't really have this. Actually, a lot of modern Judaism doesn't either. I was corrected a number of times by my Jewish friends after Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, where we'd say rest in peace or she's in a better place. And they'd say, well, she was Jewish and she didn't believe that they don't really have the same well-defined afterlife ideas.
But
And
we
so they're
don't
more,
know.
yeah, well, we have no idea. But like, if they didn't believe as strongly in an eternal soul, so they don't have to think as hard about an eternal heaven or a reincarnation or what happens afterwards. And all these ideas about heaven and hell, and in some cases, resurrection or new life, and they all start to have to happen after you've established a soul. Right? I mean, the writer of Ecclesiastes is just like, well, who can descend into Sheol? When a person dies, they're gone, and that's it. And Jesus seems to think something very different.
Nobody's ever gone and come back and said anything. So we don't have them.
Other than Jesus, yeah, that's
That's the only one. So
And Samuel for a couple of minutes.
yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. Well, there's a fun story that has a lot of parallels in Homer, but that's another discussion.
Did the ancient Hebrews really have zero conception of an afterlife, though? You have these phrases like, initially, when somebody died, they would say, and he was gathered to his people. And then I think a little later on, people went to the bosom of Abraham, and you hear these references to the shades. And
yeah,
I mean, there's this, it's really never developed until seemingly this time frame between the two testaments, but it kind of seems like there's some like seminal form there.
yeah. Well, you almost have to when you introduce a human soul, then you have to start thinking about where it goes. And to my understanding, they had a similar sort of understanding to the Greeks prior to this period, where a person died and whatever was left of who they were, their energy, their soul, their spirit, whatever you want to call it, descended into the depths. They even imagined that under the earth was great oceans, and that they dwelled in the depths of Hades or of Sheol or whatever the tradition is. And it's not conscious. You're not aware of anything. Your memory rests in the earth. And we had this weird moment where Saul conjures up the spirit of Samuel from the afterlife, and he is very perturbed that he's been awoken. And he doesn't share anything about what's down there. And this happens in the Odyssey. Odysseus brings someone back up, and he's kind of annoyed that he had to wake up too. And so there's no judgment. There's not an eternal reward or an eternal punishment. You just don't exist and you go to sleep. And then during this time period, and we'll get into that in 2 weeks, I think. Yes, when we start to talk about apocalyptic literature. We start to get it, but it's still not what you would think of in like popular Christian images of the afterlife, where we imagine that you die and your soul leaves, right? It flees this mortal coil and is freed. And we even imagine sometimes that you can look down with your soul and see the body, and you're taken to the pearly gates, and your afterlife starts right then and there. The idea of the resurrection is what comes out, in that you die and your soul is somewhere else, your body decomposes, and then in the next age, the messianic age, God will create you all over again and will put your soul back into a body. And that's the great resurrection. And that's what the Bible promises. That's what Jesus is talking about. The only time he ever really talks about like going to heaven, as it were, is to the thief on the cross, where he says, "This day you'll be with me in paradise." But everything else is a reference to the resurrection of the dead, not to the dead instantly, their soul going into some spiritual realm, but this earthly realm being recreated. The Hebrew people had no problem with this earth. They didn't see this earth as fundamentally broken and icky. They didn't have this sort of dualism about like the spiritual world is perfect, this world is broken, and you can't trust it. You have to trust your reason. We get that from our buddy Plato. Not that there's anything wrong with Plato. He seems like a very nice guy.
Apparently, he was very athletic.
He was, and he participated in like the Greek equivalent of like mixed martial arts. He was in the really intense ones.
So during this time period, is this when a lot of the some of the things that we do is like rituals that celebrations and things? Is that where some of this came from during this time period, where the Greeks were? Is that? I'm trying to think. Is this during the Olympians and stuff? I'm so
Oh yeah,
far from school that I don't really remember what happened back then.
well, prior to Alexander, there was no Greece, as it were. There were small city-states all over the place that were like
Okay.
independent little ones. So if you were to say to an Athenian, call him a Greek and equate him with a Spartan, he would be very mad at you. And that, Ionian and Corinthian and, they all have their own separate things, but they were all united by a common language and a common worship of the gods. And that's why they started the Olympic Games as a way of bringing everyone together. Alexander the Great competed in the Olympic Games. Like, he was apparently pretty good at it. So they all get united by King Philip II of Macedon, who makes this great army, and he unites all the people, and he's this really great king that probably should be a great. And then he dies, and his son Alex just takes his dad's army and immediately just starts conquering people. He spends 10 years conquering and then dies on the battlefield on the way home. No, it doesn't even die on the battlefield. He just like dies and like doesn't rule for a single day. He's just war. He's just war. And then he dies and the whole thing goes into chaos, which is next week. But kind of flips the whole world on its head. And disperses all this language and philosophy and art and culture. So we are nearing the end of our time, and I want to respect that. And so, are there any final thoughts from any of you?
Not at this time. I'm just kind of trying to piece things together a little bit.
I hear that. I hear that very strongly.
Would it be fair to say that the Greek philosophers really kind of injected reason as a sort of a guiding principle into people's religious outlook? I mean, it seems like they all believed in fairly capricious gods, and including the Hebrew God, up until they kind of said, well, wait a minute.
Mm.
Am I kind of understanding that correctly?
You are. Yeah. The old
Okay.
way of
I'm not
thinking,
saying
the
it
sort of
very well, but
the mythos way of thinking, looks
right.
at individual situations. So if lightning strikes this tree and it burns down, the question then becomes, who angered Zeus that
You're right.
this particular thing happened? Under the new Logos way of thinking, it strikes that tree and you notice it, and then it strikes a tree over there and you look for similarities between the two, and you find a universal concept that explains all lightning, as opposed to individual stories that explain individual things.
Right.
Which is why Thales was able to make a killing on olives, because he noticed the patterns of the winds and the weather and the rains, and how the rains the year before affected the olive harvest that year, and noticed patterns, made theories, tested the theories, and then went from there. And that's that change in mindset from the individual to the universal. And then that works its way into their philosophy and into their ways of thinking. And then it's no longer, are you making the right sacrifice right now to please the God in this moment? And it becomes, what can we know about this God universally? What truths can we get out of this? And that's something that we're still doing today. We're much more interested in learning about who God is as opposed to what God is doing. Most of us. There's still people who will see a hurricane and say that's because God is punishing this person or that person.
Right.
So thank you for diving straight in. Thank you for letting me talk about the Greeks for a little while. We're going to talk more about Egyptians next week. Next week is when, like I said in the end of the video, that's when the Bible gets translated into Greek, which is kind of when it starts to solidify as a canon. That's the Bible that Jesus and the disciples will use, by the way, the Greek one that they put together in Alexandria for the big library. It's when all of the fun mixtures of Greek and early Judaism start to coalesce into something, as this huge community in Alexandria grows, which is probably where Jesus fled to as a baby, into Alexandria, which was by Cleopatra's time 25% Jewish, which is like a second Jerusalem in Egypt. Ironically, because that's where they came from. They
Okay.
have this tendency to go between Palestine and Egypt, and so I look forward to that with you all.
Everybody have a good week and a weekend.
And you as well.
You too.
God bless you both.
Same to you. Now I got to figure out.